MDiv from Western Seminary. He has a master's in theology from the University of Chicago. He has a PhD in Old Testament from Duke, and he has taught religion at other institutions, including Central College, but now he's based here in Holland. And has led more than 20 immersion tours on behalf of the RCA, taking people into Israel and Palestine and understanding the history, the archaeology in this situation that we're going to be discussing here the next 3 weeks. By the way, in another role, kind of an avocational role that maybe Josh will mention sometime before he's done these 3 weeks, he has convened a community group here in Holland called Still Processing that meets about once a month at the Brew Merchant in Washington Square, bringing together theists, atheists, and agnostics for discussion and conversation about interesting issues. I've been privileged to be his guest a couple times. He brings in different people to interview and then engages people in conversation. And I can tell you he is very widely read and thoughtful, and I think that that's going to be apparent to us. As always, I remind you that particularly on this particular topic, the next 3 weeks, that our sessions are live streamed and they're also recorded on the internet, so whatever you say will be there for all humanity in perpetuity. But don't let that intimidate you, because we want a freewheeling, honest conversation. And thank you, Josh, for your work and for joining us these 3 weeks.
Thank you, Dr. Myers. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Hopefully that will stop. It might not. We'll live with it either way. I'll add one thing that could be useful. Some of you will know this, but I did make a documentary on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict called The Law and the Prophets, and it is available on YouTube, and it is better than you might think. Coming from just somebody who'd never made a film before, but I did work with professionals. And if you want to get, in the course of 2 hours, a really basic understanding of the history and the current realities, I think it does a really good job of that. And other people who have no interest in my success have also said so. People who are experts, like Laura Friedman, if you've heard of her, from the Foundation of Middle East Peace, has said the similar things about the film. So check that out if you want to learn a bit more or get a quick intro. It's about 2 hours long. I have this quote up here that I wanted to say something quickly about. It's on the bottom there. I want us to live. I want us to want to live in this world, in this time, together. And that is from Adrienne Marie Brown. And she is sort of like a community activist. She had a really interesting conversation with Krista Tippett on being. I welcome you to look it up. I know that that's too simplistic to solve the world's problems, just wanting us to live together, wanting us to want to live together. But I like that simplicity, and it's really all I want for all of us. And I don't need it to be any certain way religiously, I will say. There are other things I want for this region, like democracy, equal rights. I want humanitarian rights to be, and international law to be respected, right? So there are some things I do want. But within that, I think there's a lot of room for us to create something there, or for them really to create something there that accomplishes this goal. I'm going to skip ahead to a couple things here. I'm just going to give you a chance to look at this for a minute, and then I'll probably point out a couple of things. It's really hard to do the history of Israel-Palestine in any comprehensive or even responsible way, even in 3 weeks. And because there's so much to talk about in the present, I want to spend a decent amount of time talking about the present with just enough past sprinkled in so that we're not lost. That's kind of the goal of the next 3 weeks. Talk about the present talk enough about the past so as not to be lost about the present. Does that make sense as a goal, at least? Difficulty, right? We're all coming in with different understandings and different abilities within understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on our past experiences with it. So feel free to stop and ask questions when you need that. This is a shorthand abridged history here. And I tried to keep out anything I didn't think was super important. Ultimately, we are 2007 to present has really been, and maybe I would say 2000, the second Palestinian uprising or intifada in 2000 until now. The past 25 years have been a continuation of what came before it. And I'll try and explain what that means. I'll give you some context using a quote from Rashid Khalidi, who is a Palestinian historian at Columbia University. And he's going to talk about the colonial aspects of Israel, the colonial aspects of our own country, right? And that, this piece of the colonialism after the second intifada is where there is a shift, I think. And that's why I want to bring that up, because in this modern part here, starting in roughly 2000, after 9/11 and after the second, during and after the second intifada, there's a significant shift in the way Palestinians are treated in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, and on their freedom of movement. The wall starts to be built in 2000 around the West Bank. That dramatically changes things for Palestinians. So we're going to focus a lot of our time in that time period, post-2000, post-intifada, and up until now. That being said, is there anything on here that you want to ask a question about? Please.
Just a minute, we'll get Mike.
Oh, Mike.
I think Barbara Timmer and I come at this from the background of 20 years living in Los Angeles. My partner is Jewish, our friends are Jewish, so I want to put that out there. But I would say the second bullet, 1947, 48, when the Israel accepted the mandate, and every Arab country in 1948 attacked Israel. I would put that 1948 date, make it clear that there were two choices, or there were two roads that could be taken, and that in 1948 every Arab country attacked Israel. I think that's one thing that frankly is important.
Right. The only thing I would say about that, and the reason I don't have that up there in that way, is I would say there's some dispute about 1948 amongst all involved, all historians involved, and all political scientists involved, in terms of who's the aggressor, who's the one with more power, who were the ones that were more vulnerable, and who were the ones that were more powerful, right? I think that question is increasingly clear, though debated. And so I'd rather at this point, we're going to get into talking about this in the context of Israel. That would be next week, and then the context of Palestinians the week after.
I'm just surprised you didn't start with the Ottoman Empire.
I mean, I could have, right? It's sort of hidden in there, under 1890 to 1947, roughly, right? It's hidden in there as the power up until the end of World War I, right, is the Ottoman Empire. It doesn't, in the modern, like in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian, whatever you want to call it, conflict is kind of difficult. It's not two states fighting each other, right? Which is a mistaken view that a lot of people have and continue to have. I don't think the Ottoman Empire really plays much of a role, or has, since the end of World War I. So that would be my reason for not having it up there. But again, debatable, I'm sure. Anybody else? It's worth pointing out these outbreaks of violence since 2007. I know those are really small and you can't read them, so let me do that. The reason I point them out is because there has been a dramatic increase in the amount of deaths in this current conflict in 2023, 24, including until today. We're at more than 41,000 Palestinians killed. Prior to that, in this sort of post-2000 Second Intifada era, I mean, the Second Intifada itself was very violent. And something like, I think, 3,000 Israelis were killed. That includes mostly civilians. And something like 6,000 Palestinians were killed. Again, mostly civilians. But that was considered a high death toll over a 5-year period, right? And now we're looking at 41,000 Palestinians killed. Dramatic, dramatic escalation. Let's do a few maps just to place ourselves. That's too small to matter, I feel like. Let's try this one. Just so we have a feel for Gaza and the West Bank. They are very close to each other. These are the two territories that we would call the Palestinian territories. Some debate about calling them both occupied, because in Gaza, if you go back here, Israel did disengage from Gaza in 2000, where is it on there? 2005, I believe, or 6. Yeah, 2005, under Sharon. So they don't have a presence inside Israel, a physical presence since 2005, Israel, in Gaza, but they still control the borders, what comes in and out. There's still significant control that Israel has over the Gaza Strip. So I'm still comfortable calling them both occupied territories. But just to let you know, there's some debate about that. Okay. This is the size, this gives you some feel for the size of the Gaza Strip. 6 miles, roughly, wide, if you want. And long is about, what does it say there, 25 miles. It's a tiny, tiny strip of land. Easy to forget that it's a tiny strip of land. Okay. Just some more things on death tolls and casualties, injuries. Most of Israel's deaths came on October 7 and 8. Since then, you have IDF soldiers killed at 594, which is pretty startling. We're talking 594 IDF soldiers killed and over 41,000 Palestinians killed since fighting began, right? Since the war began. That is significantly different. It's hard to look at that and not think something has gone terribly awry here. This is damage in the Gaza Strip. 60% of residential buildings, 80% of commercial facilities, 65% of cropland, 17 of 36 hospitals partially functional right now, 65% of road networks damaged, 85% of school buildings damaged. This is the list of journalists killed. There are no foreign journalists allowed into Gaza. There have basically not been any foreign journalists allowed into Gaza since the invasion began on October 27th. Once in a while, Israel will how would you say it, accompany or bring in journalists to show them certain things, which is not what we would call freedom of the press, right? If you're being shown particular things by one of the two sides of a conflict, you're being shown propaganda in some way. Whatever truth is in it, who knows? You're not going to find that out. So most of the journalists killed were Palestinians. As of, I think this was updated in July or something like that. You have 120 Palestinians killed. So we do not have good information, really, about what is happening in Gaza. We have information, but do we have really good information? No. We don't have good information about what's happening inside Israel or the West Bank, especially when it comes to Palestinians who've been detained. We don't even know how many Palestinians have been detained by Israel since October 7th. There is just a gap in our knowledge here, and that is intentional. That is intentionally being done by Israel in this case. Just some feel for the destruction in a map. Now I'll have to explain this, and I'll do it relatively quickly. So on the right-hand side, you have Aleppo in Syria. It's 1.5 times the area of northern Gaza, which you have on your left. So Russia and the government of Bashar al-Assad waged a multi-year battle. I think it was 2013 to 16, so 3 years. And 40% of Aleppo's structures were damaged, and that's the yellow and orange here. And then in northern Gaza, the figure reached 32% by November 26, 7 weeks into the conflict. So it took about 7 weeks of bombing in the northern Gaza. So an area roughly the size of Aleppo that underwent the same amount of damage in about 3 years. So that initial bombing was, there are headlines saying it exceeds really anything in the modern era, the intensity of the bombing, including Allied bombing in Europe. Of course, who can say exactly? These are difficult to measure. But it was extremely, extremely intense. It's worth noting.
Can I ask a question?
You may.
Yeah, I was just wondering, is it on? Okay. You know, the death toll for Palestinians is high, as well as the damage. But what I've wondered about when Hamas did that October 7th, horrible, horrible attack, what did they think was going to happen? Mm-hmm. What did they think the response would be? And weren't they very completely stupid about what they did? Because it was, they knew how Israel was going to respond, didn't they?
Yeah.
Well, why would they do such a thing when they knew that the response was going to be horrible? So why go through with something like that?
Yeah. I'm gonna answer it sort of quickly, because I think I can do a better job of it in 2 weeks when I talk about the Palestinian context. I would say there's a couple of things. They are a fundamentalist Islamic group, and fundamentalist religious groups are destructive and violent. And they want to get their way, and they don't care who dies.
And they don't care who dies.
That's right.
So it's really on them.
The 40,000 deaths?
Yeah.
All of them?
Yeah. They started it.
Okay. So we're probably going to have to at least touch on like international law and whether we care about it.
International law.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because under international law, it doesn't matter who starts it. It doesn't matter how grave the atrocities of the other side are. If you sign on to international treaties, as Israel has, as the US has, as basically every civilized country has, you are bound by those. And Israel has broken those international laws, not only in this conflict, obviously so. I'm talking tens of thousands of murders, intentional murders by Israel, dwarfing anything that Hamas did in terms of the numbers of dead. It's not close. Israel, as a signature, right? Signatory to Fourth Geneva Convention, certain UN resolutions, the Hague Conventions, lots of other things, they are bound by international law, as is the US, as is the Palestinians, Hamas. And they definitely committed war crimes on October 7th. And they should face justice for that. But it does not give Israel the right, under the system we have. It's a system of rules. We give lip service to it, at least. This is where we are right now, I'd say, in human history. We've made some decent rules to govern war so that it is not so brutal and terrible. To protect civilians, mostly, but also to protect things like land. So you're not supposed to, post-World War II, be able to take land from another entity, country usually, in war. Even if they start it, even if you hate them and feel justified, for example. You're not allowed to bomb indiscriminately. You're not allowed to do collective punishment, meaning closing off food, water, supplies for hospitals. These are all war crimes, and they've all been committed by Israel blatantly since October 7th. So it's really a question of what kind of world do we want to live in, and what kind of example do we and Israel and other countries that say we're civilized and democratic and we care about liberal democracy and we want to see that spread around the world. We care about human rights. We say that proudly. It's something I'm proud of when we do it. If we're not going to care about those things, meaning in this case, say, Israel, do whatever you want. What they did to you is so awful. You can kill as many of their people, be they women, children, men who have no association with Hamas. You may do whatever you want. You may use the 2,000 bombs that we have given you plentifully. I have that on here somewhere. I'll probably be able to find it. That is an option. We can live in a world like that if we want. I don't think we want to. I don't think that's a good future for anybody. There may be a time, it may be hard to imagine, but there may be a time in which humanitarian laws and international laws that we're calling upon them for protection, or our kids or our grandkids, in a future that's hard to imagine right now, in which China is powerful enough to take us on in a war. So I think that's the trouble with that line of argumentation. I don't think Israel should be given a blank check or should be excused from responsibility. Here's the money. So Israel, it's interesting to have this chart because it doesn't just show Israel, it shows the other countries that we give significant military and economic aid to. Israel dwarfs all of them. You probably know this already, but it's important context since we're trying to place the context here as the United States and its relationship to Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. 69%, it says 65 here, that's a little bit earlier chart. It's actually the new numbers here from 2019 to 2023. It's 69% of Israel's imports of major conventional arms are from the US. Germany being really the other major provider of weapons, I guess not surprisingly, considering their terrible history with the Jewish people. Let's see. In March, it was reported that the administration had quietly, so this past March, quietly made more than 100 other military sales to Israel since the start of the war, most falling below the dollar amount that would require Congress to be formally notified. So these are ones we just don't even really hear about. Like 100 of them happened And we found out about it in March after 100 of these sales, or whatever they were exactly. I think it says sales, doesn't it? Yeah. So these are military sales, they're not aid. But they still go through the State Department. Does that make sense? So we're the ones who are arming this conflict more than anyone else. It's not really close. No, this is the one I was looking for. Biden administration has sent to Israel large numbers of munition, including more than 10,000 highly destructive 2,000-pound bombs, thousands of Hellfire missiles since the start of the war in Gaza. Those 2,000-pound bombs are the main ones that have killed thousands of women and children in Gaza, because they are typically dumb bombs. They're not guided. So you have a target, and this has all been reported. It's all public knowledge. Israel has AI systems that created targets like faster than humanly possible, it should be said. At the beginning of this war, they had two different systems, and they were dropping 2,000-pound bombs on a target of wanting to get 1 or 2 Hamas members. Again, what does that mean? We don't know. That's all hidden from us, of course. There's not much reporting on, is it a high level? Is it a low level? Is it a political Hamas member? Is it a militant Hamas member? And entire apartment buildings were leveled to kill 1 or 2 of them. Again, in terms of international law, that does not meet one of the criteria, which is proportionality. If you're going to kill someone that is considered a legitimate target, there can be some, terrible word, collateral damage. And there are different, each country does it a little bit differently, deeming how much collateral damage is acceptable. But every source I've seen that has investigated the particular criteria Israel were using at the beginning especially was that they were going far beyond an allowance of collateral damage than what the US and its allies would consider responsible. So much so that eventually, so we just had a new $20 billion weapons package that was signed. This will be future weapons. It's not going to affect the current conflict, but just to let you know, it's still happening, right? These weapons. So Biden tried to set this little line about going into Rafah, and then there was the withholding of certain 2,000-pound bombs for a bit. I think that's still in place. So we withheld certain ammunitions when Israel went into Rafah, which was in, I think, March, if I'm not mistaken. And those were these big bombs, 2,000-pound bombs and other huge munitions. So there has been a slight movement in the Biden administration on the issue of withholding arms so as to pressure Israel to act more responsibly in this war. But it is really, many would consider it a very token measure and not a serious one. But I will say that before the Rafah invasion happened, there was concern of mass casualties in that area. And I think because Biden did this, there were casualties and deaths that were avoided. I think they avoided using heavy artillery, which they would have done if Biden hadn't shown some courage in stopping them. Again, this is immediate ceasefire. I put it up here because it's April. This was, and we're now in September. So he's getting dog walked by Netanyahu. That's the truth of the matter. Netanyahu is doing whatever he wants, and Biden is giving lip service to wanting to fight back in some way, but he's not actually finding the courage. Okay, I want to play this. Since we just talked about Biden, you may wonder, and I think it's probably an interesting question, of how much power does Biden and the United States and Blinken and other people in the security apparatus in the United States, what kind of power do we have to stop Israel? or to curtail them, right? This is a clip, and it's a little, let's see how long it is. Maybe it's too long to play, but I don't think so. No, it's only a minute.
On August 12th,
Just
after epic negotiations, final terms were reached for the PLO's departure. The talks were conducted while Israel carried out the second day of the most intense bombardment.
This is the Lebanon War in 1982. Reagan's president. Israel invaded Lebanon. Okay, they're trying to negotiate a settlement. They invaded Lebanon because the PLO leadership is there, and that's a Palestinian Liberation Organization found in early 1960s. And the bombardment is heavy. And eventually Reagan catches wind of it, and that's what I want you to hear in here, mainly.
The ground attacks of the entire siege. The air and artillery assault on that day alone,
But where is
over
it?
a month after the PLO had agreed in principle.
Well, let me try again. Sorry about that.
On August 12th, after epic negotiations, final terms were reached for the PLO's departure. The talks were conducted while Israel carried out the second day of the most intense bombardment and ground attacks of the entire siege. The air and artillery assault on that day alone, over a month after the PLO had agreed in principle to leave Beirut, caused more than 500 casualties. It was so unrelenting that even Ronald Reagan was moved to demand that Begin halt the carnage. Reagan's diary relates that he called the Israeli prime minister during the ferocious offensive, adding, "I was angry. I told him it had to stop or our entire future relationship was endangered. I used the word Holocaust deliberately and said the symbol of his war was becoming a picture of a 7-month-old baby with its arms blown off." This sharp phone call impelled Begin's government to halt its reign of fire almost immediately.
I think we roughly have that same leverage now. Meaning, if Biden called and had the same tone and urgency, what's up? We trying to figure out why we're not getting a picture anymore? The same tone and urgency, a ceasefire would happen. It would have happened, it could have happened in December. It did happen in November, right? About a month and a half in, there was I don't remember what we ended up calling it, but there was a short pause in the fighting, and there was some exchanging of prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, and hostages, right? That could have happened at any moment. And it could happen at any moment right now. I think that's important to know. So I just have, okay, I'm going to turn to this because since we don't have this working, we can just do audio stuff and it'll be fine. What have I got, maybe 15 minutes? And then open it up for questions. Does that seem all right? Okay. This is from Ezra Klein. It's an audio from his January 2024 interview with Thomas Friedman. And it's a good framing for how I see the U.S. Population sort of roughly relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in this particular moment.
I've come to have this thought that is bothering me, which is that you can kind of break the politics of Israel and America down across 3 generations. There are sort of older Americans, boomers, who remember Israel being founded, potentially, who certainly remember it as young and vulnerable and as something of a miracle, as an impossibility, as winning these extraordinary battles in which it was almost wiped off the map and then wasn't, and then gained territory and built this remarkable culture and science and economy. And then you have this straddle generation, which I'm sort of part of. That's how I think about it. Gen X, older millennials, who sort of saw this mixed Israel, an Israel that by the time we were paying attention was by far the strongest power, was not vulnerable to being wiped off the map, had nuclear weapons, had control, but also lived under threat, right? Had suicide bombings, was under attack, and was also trying to find peace. There was constant peace processes, the normal thing you heard about. You heard, as you put it earlier, about the wars, but also the timeouts and the effort to become something different. And so there was a fear that it had become an occupying nation, that what was happening in the West Bank and Gaza, what was immoral, but it was trying to find a way out of that. And you could see the difficulty of it. And then you have this third generation that has only ever known the Israel of Benjamin Netanyahu, right? They only know the Israel of the last 15 years, which had stopped trying to find a way to peace, which had settled into simply occupying the West Bank, that has become much more right-wing, that had this blockade around Gaza. And when I look at those protests, right, there's always the craziest sign at the protest. There's always like the dumbest campus group you can find. But when I look at polling, where you see much less support for Israel among young people, when I look at why most people are out in the streets at a protest on behalf of Gaza, it's not mainly that they're anti-Semitic, and I think there's an effort to try to not see the thing behind the thing that is easier to see. And this sort of collapse of support for Israel among people who are younger because Israel just looks like something different to them seems both like it's picking up on something real, but also like a genuine threat to Israel in the long run, because Joe Biden and people of his generation are not going to be president forever. And I feel like this sort of rising generational threat to Israel, which people are trying to deal with by, shutting these protests down and getting college presidents fired and being angry at the kids. But what you do about that story that has taken hold and what they've seen now, including on social media, direct from Gaza, when you think on the 15 or 20 year time frame, that's something I think to take seriously. I'm curious if that tracks for you.
100%.
So I have found that I've used this in a number of presentations. I found that most people find that breakdown pretty relatable. And it's helpful just in general as people try to, I think the big reason this breakdown I think is helpful is because there's a lot of generally older Americans who do not understand the college protests in favor of Palestinians and Palestinian rights at all. It is just that gap, right? And I'm in between there. I'm 48, so I'm pretty solidly. In a way that, and this is kind of just opening another can of worms, but we got more weeks. Within those 5 years of the Second Intifada, at least twice as many Palestinians were killed by Israeli bombings using conventional weaponry, let's say, right? It just doesn't hit the same. Even now, when they've killed over 40,000, we don't know the breakdown between civilians and military or armed resistance, right, within the Palestinian Society of Gaza. We'll never know the breakdown for real. Best case scenario, Israel has put out a number, I think in March, I think they said 30% of those killed were armed militants. And people think that that's probably an exaggeration. So we're talking 20 to 30,000 innocent Palestinian civilians killed. And still, I mean, as we heard here in the class, the impact of the types, how can I say this? The impact of the way in which Hamas carries out violence against Israel, often against innocent civilians, right? In ways that I do not defend, and let me just make sure I say that out loud, right? In ways that I do not defend in any way. I don't think that because they're oppressed, they're allowed to indiscriminately kill civilians. I think it's an open question of whether Palestinians should be allowed to do any armed resistance. I would say yes, but not against civilians. I don't think anybody in here would say Israel's not allowed to do armed resistance against, right? So I don't know why it would be different for Palestinians, logically speaking. But both sides should be very cognizant of not targeting civilians. This is what the younger generation has seen. And I want to try, as I finish up here, just give you something about the framing that I think younger Americans, and I found myself thinking more about and starting to think about this conflict in this way. And it's a broader framing that includes our history and the history of other settler colonial nations and colonialism in general. So I'm going to end with that and then open it up for questions. I'll show you these afterwards. These are just as you get older, you get more sympathy for Israelis. Younger, more sympathy for Palestinians, right? And that matches those three categories of people that Klein was suggesting. I'll come back to this maybe. That's not the one I want. I'm going to do
They also always claim that they will leave the native population better off as a result of their rule. The civilizing and progressive nature of their colonial projects serves to justify whatever enormities are perpetrated against the indigenous peoples to fulfill their objectives. One need only refer to the rhetoric of French administrators in North Africa or of British viceroys in India. Of the British Raj, Lord Curzon said, "To feel that somewhere among these millions you have left a little justice or happiness or prosperity, a sense of manliness or moral dignity, a spring of patriotism, a dawn of intellectual enlightenment, or a stirring of duty where it did not before exist, that is enough. That is the Englishman's justification in India." The words "where it did not before exist" bear repeating. For Curzon and others of his colonial class, the natives did not know what was best for them and could not achieve these things on their own. "You cannot do without us," Curzon said in another speech. For over a century, the Palestinians have been depicted in precisely the same language by their colonizers as have been other indigenous peoples. The condescending rhetoric of Theodor Herzl and other Zionist leaders was no different from that of their European peers. The Jewish state, Herzl wrote, would form a part of a wall of defense for Europe in Asia, an outpost of civilization against barbarism. This was similar to the language used in the conquest of the North American frontier, which ended in the 19th century with the eradication or subjugation of the continent's entire native population. As in North America, the colonization of Palestine, like that of South Africa, Australia, Algeria, and parts of East Africa, was meant to yield a white European settler colony. The same tone towards the Palestinians that characterizes both Curzon's rhetoric and Herzl's letter is replicated in much discourse on Palestine in the United States, Europe, and Israel even today.
Okay. Settler colonialism. I'll just put up some definitions while we sit here and I field your questions so that you can get a little, these are like 3 different definitions of, that I thought were helpful of settler colonialism, which is what Rashid Khalidi is describing. And it's getting a lot of currency now as a way of understanding this particular conflict. I find it very compelling because I think, number one, it's not unique to Israel-Palestine. So I think that helps, gives us some credibility and some further understanding of this phenomenon. I also think it gets the power imbalance correct, and I think that's super important. You got it. Since we don't need it anymore, we don't need to listen to that sound. I love it. We'll do something different next week, so we don't have to do this.
We'll work on it.
Okay. Questions about this framing or anything that you want to ask about? Yes, please.
Josh, could you parse out for us a bit Hamas as both a fighting force as well as a political force?
Yeah. So it does have a political wing and a military wing. I think that the tendency is to just look at Hamas as simply a terrorist organization and then to disregard it as one of the entities that needs to be dealt with in order to solve the problem. And you can see it's happening in real time right now. There's, this ridiculous idea that we can obliterate Hamas. It's not going to happen. There is no military solution to this conflict. If we haven't learned that already, we're crazy, right? It's not going to happen. There's also not going to be a political, which is the way out of this is a political agreement without Hamas. They need to be on board, period, like it or not. And I know lots of people don't like it. Let me show you something. I don't know if I put it in here or not, though. Looks like I didn't. I was going to. There is a Hamas charter, okay? That was, the first Hamas charter is extremely terrible and anti-Semitic. And there's just no reason to talk about it as a serious document. The second one is much more interesting, and that's from 2017. And it really does form a basis that could work. Meaning the rhetoric there, which is mainly from the political wing of Hamas, I don't know how easy it is to separate political and military wings. I don't have a good feel for that. I assume that there's a lot of communication between them and coordination between them. I would imagine, but I don't know for sure. But it doesn't really matter, is what I'm trying to say. There is, and there has been openings before this. 2006 was an opening. Hamas actually took part in parliamentary elections. They actually won more seats than Fatah. But we gave that possible political solution no chance, no opportunity. It's George W. Bush. We're so close. We're war on terror. The idea that we're going to allow this group, Hamas, that we've designated as a terrorist group for good reason. By that point, second intifada had happened. They'd done scores of terrorist bombings. They earned the label. But the idea that therefore win the Palestinian population in a fair and peaceful democratic election, put some of them, more of them than Fatah, which is the secular Palestinian party, and that then we just said, no, we're not going to talk to you, you don't get a form of government, we're not even going to try this thing. That was a huge mistake, I would say, in hindsight. But it would have taken great political courage on the part of the United States, for sure, to say, okay, well, let's see if we can make this work, even though, yes, we've designated Hamas as a terrorist organization. So the summation is that Hamas can be dealt with politically. Israel knows this. They've been doing it for years. It's not impossible to include them and get a political solution. And in fact, it's impossible not to include them and get a political solution, and that's the only solution available. I mean, Ismail Haniyeh this is the other thing. Israel they just assassinate people when they want. Regardless, and if you just have to be a part of Hamas, you don't have to be in the military wing. Right? Ismail Haniyeh was the key negotiator in Qatar for a ceasefire. He went to Iran for the funeral of an Iranian, I don't remember, I think it was the president who had died in a helicopter crash, is what happened. And Israel assassinated him there. And that was like, fine? Normal, not terrorism, I guess. I don't know. I mean, the lines get very, very blurry. Look what Israel just did in Lebanon. What is that? How is that not terrorism? How? It can't be defended that label fits it so perfectly. To deny it is to show obvious bias towards Israel. Just obvious bias. It's a terrorist attack.
I have a comment and a
Yes.
question.
Sure.
My comment is partly in response to Kathy's question about, what did Hamas expect by carrying out their attack on October 7th? Our daughter lived in Israel for a time. She dated an Israeli in college who joined the Israeli army. She saw firsthand how the Israelis were treating the Palestinians,
Right.
which was not good, to say the least. And what I think happened on October 7th was that the pressure just mounted so much. It was like a pressure cooker that finally exploded, and they really didn't think of what would happen next. I mean, that's how tense the situation became over there, and how unjustly the Palestinians felt that they were being treated by the Israelis. My question is this, and David, maybe you could reply to this since you're a social psychologist. In a way, aren't we seeing the abused child, the children of the Holocaust, becoming the abusive parent? Aren't we seeing this played out in Israel and Palestine today?
I think that framing has some validity, but I think rhetorically, it's not. It's a non-starter. Like rhetorically, when you rhetorically go to aren't you doing some of the same things that happened to you in Nazi Germany to Palestinians? Which I think is partially what you're saying, or is what you're saying. That rhetorically is really hard for people to hear. I don't know that I don't even know that it matters whether it's wrong or right, the framing. It just doesn't land very well. I think we can just say there are major abuses happening on the Israeli side, right, to Palestinians, and have been happening for decades. Currently, right now, there are Palestinian prisoners whose families don't know where they are, have no idea, who are shackled somewhere, have been tortured, will be tortured more. We know where these camps are. It's called Sede Teiman. There are articles about it. I have some of the headlines here. This is from, is this the right one? Yes, this is from Haaretz. That's like the New York Times of Israel. And this was like in March or something like that. Nameless shackled Israeli ethics committee examined medical treatment of detainees from Gaza. This was at the place Sede Teiman. It's in the Negev. The idea that they had no reason to have the kind of hatred they showed on October 7th is, it's ignorance, for sure, of what's actually happening to Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and sometimes within Israel. And I think it's really hard for us to show sort of empathy towards people who did the things that some Palestinians did on October 7th. To say, like, we don't even want to understand them. We don't want to try to understand how somebody could get to the point where they're willing to do what they did, which is hard, super hard to understand how they could do that. But I do think that's worth doing, right? So you have the Gaza Strip, which in 2005, Israel leaves, and then the word that's used is besieges, meaning they cut off lots of goods. The unemployment rate's like 50% in the Gaza Strip. You don't have, electricity 24 hours a day. You're constantly trying to get items for hospitals, or if you have a sick child or a sick parent, you're trying to get them out of the Gaza Strip for treatment somewhere else, for cancer treatment. You can't get it done. I mean, they've been put under tremendous, tremendous pressure for roughly 20 years, okay? Most of the people, all of them who went into Israel on October 7th, Palestinians, were young men, ages 20 to 35, probably, okay? 20 years ago, how old were they? 0 to 15, okay? Lived for 20 years besieged by this government, the Israeli government. There's 2 million people, is that right? 2 million people in the Gaza Strip. 2,000 of them were so angry, right? So deluded in some ways by, I think, religious fundamentalism, probably propaganda. Who knows? I mean, all we have to do is look at Fox News and realize you can brainwash people and make them radical, okay? Sorry. This is what happened, and then they went and they did this awful thing. 2,000 out of 2 million. Do you think, I don't know how many people Ohio has, but if we did this treatment to the people of Ohio, do you think 2,000 people would be willing to kill? Yeah, I think there's no doubt about it. I think that matters. I think it needs to be considered.
Our time is running out, but 2 people have microphones. I'm hoping
Yes.
for really quick comments and really quick answers.
You got it.
And then
You got it.
I have a concluding thing.
Yeah, thank you again. This is a plea more to adult education. There were a number of things that you put up that I think a lot of people would have questions about. A number of things I think people would have questions about. Hearing all sides or both sides. I don't think I knew that today was going to be just this approach. I'm hoping that we have an adult ed session where we hear other definitions of colonial, where we hear about the hospitals that the doctors and Hamas use together as centers. I feel like we got one view here and well presented, and but I would like us as people that want to learn more to have better views.
My question is just this. To what degree do the average Israelis support Netanyahu?
I think the more, and I can do this pretty quickly, they don't support Netanyahu, but they support Netanyahu's views and his politics. They don't like him personally. But Netanyahu's politics are the politics of Israel, the politics of the majority. That's why he's been in power so many times. It's not because he's such an amazing political figure. It's because this is what the Israeli public thinks and wants.
Okay, let me just say, I have two questions, one of which I'm hoping you'll speak to just to wrap us up. The other I hope you'll speak to in the next 2 weeks. And
Okay.
I really resonated with Kathy's question, which was mine too. I'm wanting to understand the mentality that would lead to these horrific acts,
Yep.
given the historic disproportional Israeli response that was
Yep.
likely to follow. Help me to understand it from their perspective, but I also want mirror image, and this is speaking to Barbara, to understand in a way that an Israeli would feel like their voice is well represented here, what they're thinking in killing 41,000 Gazans and destroying 2/3 of the infrastructure. I mean, what's the strategic thinking here? Just take me inside, empathically, sympathetically, both perspectives. But my question for right now is, Hope Church supports you as an RCA church engagement facilitator in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Could you just very briefly say, now not giving your personal opinions, but what is your role? Why has the RCA hired you, and what are you doing in that role, and why are we supporting you with, and what are you doing with what we're supporting you?
Yeah. So the next 2 weeks we'll get a chance to do focus heavily on the Israeli society and culture and politics, and then Palestinian. And hopefully by the end of those 2 weeks we'll have touched on all these different perspectives. That's the intention. Although I'm going to probably continue to work out of this framework that I have, but also explain the other frameworks that other people work out of. I think we do it because we want to see peace in this part of the world. So I think that's why I've been hired. I think that we are also curious about the role of this part of the world in our theological perspectives, right? So I don't think it's just because there is this conflict there that we have this interest there. I didn't mention anything about Bible and theology and religion and the role that it's playing, but there's a version of an RCA, what am I again? Church engagement facilitator, in which this type of heavily political and sort of ideological presentation doesn't exist, but rather people are just going to Israel, Palestine on trips and learning about the archaeology of the Bible and going to the places they read about in the Bible, and that's sort of the end of it. I think, we've deemed, my parents started this before me, that is irresponsible. But it means we have to walk into this very difficult, fraught environment, fraught in every single way, politically, theologically, culturally, and try and speak as to how peace could exist by understanding the history and the current realities. So mainly that's what I'm focused on as an RCA missionary.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yep, I'm going to cut it off. I know some of you still have questions or comments, so I invite you back next week. But my friend Liz Testa is preaching today, and you need to be to worship on time. So thank you very much,
Thanks.
Josh.
I'll see you next.
Yeah. It's complicated. Yeah, thank you. Thank
Thanks.
you.